The moon is something I'm sure we have all dreamed about as kids. So far away from Earth, yet always visible. Across hundreds of different countries, societies, and civilizations, humanity has always dreamed of going to the moon. You can't simply tell me that you've never looked up at that pale crescent in the sky and became filled with wonder. I wonder what might be up there, how it affects our world, maybe if it's made of cheese or not. In terms of humanity, we answered this question. Through hard work, dedication, and some major feats of engineering, humanity was finally able to make it to the moon in July of 1969. Today at the Kerbal Space Center, we plan on doing the same thing, though with far less dedication, far less hard work, and far less engineering. Hello guys, it's Messier82 and in today's video, me and my cat Bo will be going to the moon with you guys. This two-part video involves our first two moon missions. Mission number 1 will be a simple orbit, nothing too crazy. Part 2 on the other hand is a full Apollo-style landing mission, although I have to admit it was plagued with a bunch of failures and absolutely could have gone better. Good thing we brought a spacesuit. Through physics, bigger experiments, and even bigger failures, we eventually made our way to the moon in true KSP fashion. But there were a few overarching questions this video. How do we get to the moon? What is the easiest way to do it? Can my cat Bo comprehend the advanced intricacies of space travel? All to be answered soon. But for our first order of business, we needed to, get to the moon. Maybe not to the surface, but we at least need a rocket capable of getting us there and back. Something bigger, cooler, and more stylish than any rocket we've ever built. And with that, it was time for our first launch vehicle, our lunar... wait, that's not right. Mooner orbital vehicle, or Munner, I don't know. I'll say Mooner because it sounds better. We need to pack extra fuel and Delta V on this rocket, more on that later by the way. But there is a bit of a technique from going to the moon that will save us as much fuel as possible. Let's take a look at how we're going to go to the moon. If we want to go to the moon as efficiently as possible, we need to start with a low Earth orbit, or rather, a low Kerbin orbit. How do we transfer from this low orbit to a high orbit such as the moon? Well, it's pretty simple. The most efficient and easiest way to go from a low orbit to a high orbit is known as the Hohmann transfer orbit. A Hohmann transfer orbit, or just Hohmann transfer, is an orbital maneuver used to transfer spacecraft between orbits of different altitudes around a central body. Meaning, if you want to change the altitude, the semi-major axis, or just about anything about your orbit, this is the most efficient way to do it. But before we show you guys how to do one, we need to learn two terms, prograde and retrograde. These are two of the most important terms in rocketry. Prograde essentially just means towards the rotational motion of your orbit, or sort of with the flow of your orbit in other words. Retrograde on the other hand is the opposite. Retrograde is facing against the flow of your orbit. Propelling yourself prograde directly adds energy or speed into your orbit, therefore raising the maximum altitude, or semi-major axis. Propelling yourself retrograde, on the other hand, directly removes energy from your orbit. This essentially just slows you down, and if you're in a circular orbit, it will reduce your minimum altitude, or semi-minor axis. That being said, both of these maneuvers can be used to circularize as well. Think of it sort of like the gas and the brakes in a car. Prograde burns are like hitting the gas and speeding up, whereas a retro burn is more like slamming the brakes and slowing down. Both of these maneuvers can not only be used to change altitude, but also to circularize. To do our transfer orbit and to transfer to a higher altitude, we need to start by burning prograde as mentioned before. That'll speed us up. Once our orbit becomes all eccentric and reaches our target altitude, we cut the burner. When we reach the peak of our orbit, we burn prograde once again until our orbit circularizes. This directly adds altitude and energy into your orbit in the most efficient way possible. When it comes to going to the moon, it's just about the easiest target we have for this. It's close, it has a relatively large gravity well, and it's just an all-around easy target. When we enter its sphere of gravitational influence, we won't have to worry about circularizing our orbit too much because the moon will do it all for us. All we have to do is slow down so we don't go flying past it. Or, even worse, straight into it. But unfortunately, to get to the moon, we don't have any fancy schmancy sci-fi tech to help us out. So if we want to get to the moon in a realistic way, we're gonna need a little bit more fuel than our previous rockets, so we needed some new tech. Here on the tech tree, thanks to our previous missions, we could afford some new parts. Some of these parts involve using this new tech, we'll be able to provide more electric power, struts, and a few other needed qualities to our rocket. Take a look at this, for example. This is the Lunar Orbiter 1. Very creative name, I know. The mission is simple. Go orbit the moon and come back home to Kerbin alive. Today we'll be sending up Tim C. Kerman as our honorary first astronaut to orbit and land on the moon. You see, I think Tim and I got off on the wrong foot, and as the now most experienced astronaut in our space agency, he knows what he's doing more than anyone else, and I believe he'll be just about the only astronaut who can make it to the moon and back alive. The Lunar Orbiter 1 starts with a launch stage, which consists of 4 small SRBs to get us off the ground, as well as a few liquid fuel motors that will sustain us to a higher altitude. After this, the more efficient orbital sustainer stage activates and takes us through the transfer orbit mentioned before. After one successful revolution around the moon and Kerbal Kind's first view of the dark side, we'll head back home, splash down somewhere in the ocean near the KSC, and prepare for our next flight. Seems simple enough in practice, right guys? Well, luckily nothing really went wrong this flight, but I'll let you guys see for yourself. See you guys in the sky. For the start of this flight, I didn't end up using full throttle as I wanted the SRB rockets to propel me a little bit more and not have to worry all too much about air resistance. On top of this, the lower speeds reduces the dynamic pressure acting on the rocket, therefore reducing the chance of failure, but that's a lot of technical jumbo. All it really means is it's going to help me not blow up. After gaining a little bit of speed and altitude, I started my orbital insertion term. This orbital insertion is just a rocket term for when you want to insert your big rocket into an orbit. Essentially, when you're going up, it's best to start your turn in the direction of the intended orbit as you approach space. This typically comes in the form of a slow, sweeping, semi-passive maneuver. This sort of sets you up for your pro-grade maneuvering in the future. You always gotta be thinking at least one step ahead when it comes to a lot of this stuff, so that's pretty important. After finally getting into low Kerbin orbit, we set ourselves up with a maneuvering node aiming within an approximately 70-degree incidence, or delta theta I guess, with the moon as recommended by the community. Unfortunately, this transfer maneuver was so close to accurate with the moon's position, I actually would have run directly into it. So once I got into the moon's sphere of influence, I had to maneuver once again to make sure I didn't go slamming into it. But this in fact set us up perfectly for an orbit around the moon. This will be the first vessel to ever cross the dark side of the moon due to its tidal locking. Isn't that just insane? I guess you could say that Tim here must be over the moon about it. No? Alright, fine, I'll stop it with the moon puns. I really apologize for that one. I bet you guys think I'm a lunatic. Right, never mind. Anyways, on the way back for both of these missions, I have a very dumb lunar escape orbit and I wasted a little bit of Delta V, but that's okay. I'll explain why later. On re-entry, to avoid pulling too many G's and stressing the capsule, we ended up setting our periapsis to approximately 40 to 45 kilometers altitude. This made it so on the first pass we just slowed down enough to keep our orbit going, skip back off into space and complete another orbit before coming back down. This puts less stress on our airframe, as well as makes sure that Tim here pulls a little bit less G's. At this point though, we passed right over the KSP and went straight into the ocean past it. I'll be honest, I tried to get close to the KSC, but I never thought it would be that close. I made sure to take a commemorative photo while passing over the KSC, which I'll show you guys later. With Tim C safely returned to Kerbin, however, it was time to move on to our next research, and therefore our next lunar mission. With the success of that mission, I set off to complete some side quests, you could call them, to get more research. After a few successful but rather pointless side quests, we were able to just about complete Tier 1 of the tech tree. Tier 2, here we come. With that, we get a few new payload and structural capabilities, but nothing major. It was time to build our Lunar Lander rocket, but first, we want to talk a little bit about the anatomy of the real-life lunar missions, as well as some of the basic physics explaining what we need to get there. You see, it's one thing to just orbit the moon, but to take off from Kerbin, orbit Kerbin, go to the moon, orbit the moon, land, take off again, orbit again, and then go back to Kerbin, that requires a lot of fuel. Or, not really fuel, but delta V. You see, in rocketry, your range is measured in a unit known as delta V. Delta V simply stands for a change in, or delta, velocity. Delta, by the way, stands for change in physics. So like if you say delta x, that's like a change in displacement or a change in distance. Delta V is a change in velocity. It means essentially how much our rocket can maneuver before running out of fuel. Because ultimately, a change in velocity over time is an acceleration. And an acceleration can only be performed by expending fuel. So in order to maneuver in a rocket at all, you have to expend fuel no matter what. This is why delta V is such an important term in rocketry. I mean, come on guys, it's not rocket science. Well, you know, maybe it is rocket science, and maybe I should really stop making these crappy puns. But anyway, since literally every single maneuver you could ever make in space inherently requires a change in velocity, or acceleration, it means that this rocket can do more stuff before running out of fuel if it has more delta V. Let's take two rockets for example. In KSP, delta V is calculated in the VAB in the bottom right of your screen. Delta V, in terms of math, is more or less a calculation of your specific impulse or exhaust velocity, efficiency, and fuel fraction. You know what, let's take a look at that delta V equation. Delta V equals exhaust velocity, or as we learned in the last episode, specific impulse, times the natural logarithm of mass initial over mass final. As we remember from the last video, exhaust velocity and specific impulse are essentially the same thing. The faster you can throw stuff out the back, the more force you'll get for less fuel. Because remember guys, momentum is not only mass but also velocity. So basically, to break it down for the layman here, this first part of the equation is just saying, if your rocket is more efficient, you'll be able to cover more distance. Makes sense, right guys? Part 2, on the other hand, is just a form of a fuel fraction. Not a direct fuel percentage as a percentage of 1, but as some form of measurement of fuel fraction just using an inverse set. For the layman here, basically all it's saying is the more fuel you can hold comparative to the weight of your craft, the further you'll go. But due to that natural logarithm there, you will in fact have some form of diminishing returns. So you'll get more benefit from going from 20 to 40% fuel than from 40 to 60% fuel. That also seems to make sense, right guys? In order to launch from Kerbin, get into orbit, transfer to the moon, orbit the moon, land, take off, come back to Kerbin, and slow yourself down enough to enter the atmosphere without obliterating yourself, that's going to cost you over 10,000 meters a second in delta V, according to the game at least. Now that is a lot of movement. This would require a rather large rocket presumably, with quite a few stages to make it. Now you might be saying, well Messier, it's more or less a type of fuel fraction, not a total mass that matters, so why use the bigger rockets? Why not just dedicate more mass to fuel? Well, it's simple, it's because we have a bigger payload and we need big engines. When we talk about rocket mass in that delta V equation, we include everything. The payloads, the engines, the fuel tanks, structures, the bird that accidentally got inside the electrical compartment and is now along for the ride, everything. So if we want to launch a bigger payload, we simply need a bigger rocket to get there. And to launch a lander and a return stage, we'd need a pretty big rocket. So guys, take a look at this. Project Moon 1. This rocket consists of a large takeoff stage utilizing the larger SRBs I just unlocked, as well as a liquid fuel stage. Kinda the same idea as the last one. From here, we had a large tri-motor orbital stage with a higher exhaust velocity. Or, you know, more efficient engines you could call it. This stage was simply designed to take us to lunar orbit. From there, we have the return capsule and a lander stage. Both the lander stage and the capsule are designed to disconnect in low lunar orbit, where the lander takes Tim down to the surface. Once Tim lands, he plants a flag, he takes a surface sample, he cheers, the entire mission control goes crazy, and he eventually returns to his rocket. Once he does this, he enters the lander stage once again and launches off into space, where he will then rendezvous with the space capsule. Separating the lander and the return stage allows me to carry even more Delta V and carry higher payloads for less fuel, although my calculations ended up not being perfect and it became a problem later in the game. More on that later though. Anyways, once we rendezvous with the return capsule, we abandon the lander stage in low orbit and return home. When we're about to enter the atmosphere, we'll disconnect the rocket stage and a thermal shield and drag chutes are attached to the capsule, which allows us to slow down for a hopefully gentle landing. The Moon Project 1 and its staging here shares some similarities with a real-life moon mission, the Apollo projects, which I want to teach you guys about today. The Apollo missions were launched off of the Saturn V rocket, which is largely considered one of the biggest heavy lift rockets, as well as one of the largest liquid fuel only rockets. I mean, I think it's barely been surpassed by rockets such as the N1 and Starship, but that's another story. Similar to my mission, the Apollo mission also featured a detachable lander stage where the return capsule remained in orbit. 2 of the astronauts went to the surface where one managed the return capsule. After rendezvous, they returned to the capsule and all 3 astronauts returned to Earth. Our Mooner Mission 1, however, only has 1 person and is designed for a much smaller payload. Also, we need a lot less Delta V since Kerbin is just so much smaller than Earth. The real-life Apollo missions need about 1.5 times more fuel to make it to the moon and then back. That, on top of the payload needed, means that the Apollo missions were several times bigger than our rockets in KSP here, and it's honestly a feat of human engineering. If you guys don't know the anatomy of the Apollo missions, I highly recommend looking it up because it's very, very, very impressive. But enough about that, let's move on to the launch. And then we had to scrub that launch because of some issues with the design and try again. And with that, we are off the ground. In true KSP fashion, I completely forgot to turn on my stability computers for the first leg of the flight, but that's alright. Our launch sequence otherwise was near identical to the last one, but a little bit slower on the way up. Thank goodness we had those SRBs to get off the ground with. But all the same, we made it into orbit with our heavier payload and we are setting ourselves up for the transfer. Upon activation of the first sustainer stage, well, here's where the problem occurs. I don't know what happens. Maybe I designed a fuel tank incorrectly, maybe the engines were too close together, or maybe the infamous space krakens got to us, but the middle engine kinda sorta blew up and took a little bit of the fuel tank with it. Disaster in flight. This was not good. But you see, we are a little bit idiotic, so we decided to continue the mission anyways. By the time we completed our transfer orbit and maneuvered ourselves in position with a low lunar orbit, we were almost out of fuel by this stage. That would have been problematic if we ran out of fuel. Now initially my plan was to use the remaining fuel in the sustainer stage as a sort of Delta V cushion for the lander stage. So once we disconnected the capsule, we'd use that on the way down a little bit to slow ourselves, and then we would, detach it and go down with the rest of the lander stage. But I forgot to do this. Either way, this looked super cool and it reminded me of the KSP2 trailer back in 2020. I was so excited to finally be playing this. I'm not gonna lie, guys. I've been a huge KSP fan my whole life. But anyways, this is where our second problem occurred because I didn't end up using the sustainer stage as a Delta V cushion. You see, because of this, we didn't actually have the Delta V to make it back to rendezvous. I didn't realize this at the time, but we came inches away from stranding Tim Kerman in orbit. We would have done a rescue mission, of course. I wouldn't have been able to sleep at night knowing I had left him in orbit, but that's not the point. Since by now we didn't really know of any of these problems in our actual flight, I'm just not going to comment on them until they really occur. Well, we took a picture of ourselves leaving the capsule behind because it really looked awesome, totally reminded me of the KSP2 trailer, and on approach we ended up being stupid and instead of going for the lowlands of the moon like I should have, We actually ended up landing on the highlands where the terrain was far more uneven. So on approach here, I'm being very careful with the lander, trying to approach as gently as possible, and then I accidentally tap the Z key and my rocket goes flying up, just wasting even more delta V. This is where the second problem comes in. So we come down for another gentle landing, and when I try and get out, I realize the rocket starts to tip over here. So I need to take off once again and reposition the rocket to find another landing spot. Once again, wasting our fuel, wasting our delta V. But we eventually do find a landing spot. And here we finally got to plant our flag on the moon. We collected some surface samples, we saw an awesome view of Kerbin from the moon. Another screenshot, totally picture-worthy. We'll save that one in the picture books. And we returned to our rocket, also testing out my jetpack a little bit. Next time we go to the moon, we're bringing a rover. But we returned to our rocket and we took off once again, shooting for a rendezvous with the capsule. And then disaster struck. I was already a little bit worried about it because of the delta V we wasted, but it wasn't until now that I fully realized we would not make it back to the capsule. We were in a bad situation, so I needed to act fast. Tim, luckily still having his EVA suit on, got out of the rocket, abandoned the lander stage, and started using his jetpack. We ended up eyeballing our way into rendezvous with the capsule using the jetpack. We were running low on fuel, so I needed to be very careful on my approach here. And then, I guess in some ways, disaster almost struck again. I ended up hitting the window side of the capsule instead of the ladder side, and when I touched it, Tim just bounced off of it at Mach 6 in the other direction. So I needed to burn even more jetpack fuel, which we were already very low on, in order to get there. By the end of this, we were so low on fuel that if I had touched the throttle to maneuver even once more, we would have ran out. So once we got close enough, I turned off the jetpack and essentially sent Tim Hail Mary straight towards that capsule. And you know what? We just barely made it. At this point, I was like, holy crap, I was like freaking out, like we almost stranded Tim in space there, but we were okay. So I didn't even care about my escape trajectory. I just wanted to get the hell away from the moon. So that's exactly what we did. We just burned ourselves prograde until we were in an escape orbit, and then, you know, configured ourselves later. We had enough delta V to do it anyways. I didn't really care. I just wanted to get out of there. You know what? I'm gonna send up some other intern next time, get them some experience too. Anyways, with that, we managed to slow down our orbit nice and slow and just send the capsule straight back to the shoreline. And you know what? Tim here landed. He splashed down in the middle of the ocean. Maybe he can sit outside and enjoy a nice pina colada or something while waiting for the rescue crew to come get him. Here at Messier's Space Program, I'm sure we pack pre-packaged cocktails for the astronauts to enjoy once they land. Anyways, I shall see you guys in the next one. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys later. If any of you guys have any recommendations for this series, go tell me in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.